This video is about social services and the provision of social services from chapter 10 in the textbook. We are following in South Africa the convention of the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. That should be interesting to you, that we don't just have our own classification, but we follow an international classification of government expenditure. And according to this system, we distinguish between 5 functional categories of social services, namely education, health, social protection, housing, and community amenities. In this chapter, you will have to discuss the market failure based arguments for government involvement in the provision of education. I think we've done enough of that, so don't focus on education for the second semester test, rather only for the exam. Then the market failure based arguments for government involvement in the provision of healthcare. That's important. So whenever you read the first 2 sections of this chapter, focus on healthcare. We will look at a graph showing the excess burden of a subsidy. That's very general and always applicable. Then we will show that an in-kind subsidy can be welfare enhancing if the consumption of the good or service in question yields positive externalities. We've seen some of that before, but this is just another angle on the topic. So if you look at paragraph 10.1.2 healthcare, that's important. And I've highlighted 2 reasons for the government to intervene. So you should still be thinking of market failures. Why does the government have to deal with healthcare? It's because the private market fails as a result of externalities in marked in orange and imperfect information in yellow. So for the competitive market, we assume perfect information. And as soon as information is not perfectly available, then the market fails. So in terms of externalities, you know by now that if the government prevents the spreading of contagious diseases, that's like providing a public good, or it's conferring positive external benefits to society. So we will look at a graph doing that. Then in terms of imperfect information, you can just think for yourself that unpredictable illnesses and injuries, it's always unpredictable. So we never have full information about health issues. You cannot forecast how your health will be for the next day, never mind the next week or the next year or so. So because there are imperfect information, the private markets will always fail. 2 very important topics in this paragraph, it's still 10.1.2, is adverse selection and moral hazard. You can really expect a question on that, at least the definition of adverse selection and moral hazard, and what does it mean in terms of healthcare. So adverse selection means the market attracts the wrong clients. So that whole paragraph on page 195 is really important. So you should definitely read the whole paragraph, and it's about the fact that some people are particularly likely to seek insurance cover. So if your health is not very good, then you would be more inclined to seek insurance cover, health insurance cover, if you are a high risk person in terms of health. So the market attracts sick people. It's not normal. So everybody doesn't have the same probability of going to the doctor. And so if the medical profession has to determine a price, they will determine an average price between high risk and low risk people. So the healthy people like you and me will pay higher premiums for medical services, because there are many other people that put pressure on the health market and they drive up the market. So that's adverse selection. The market selects the wrong people. The market will select people with high risk in terms of health. That's adverse selection. Moral hazard has to do with behavior after you have bought your medical insurance. It's like car insurance. We've had this example before. If your car is insured, then you can afford to drive more recklessly, because the insurer will just pay if you have an accident. So moral hazard means people go to the doctor too often, even if they are not sick. And that's exactly what's happening with people with medical insurance. And we will have a graph which I think is very important in this regard, to show that if people go to the doctor all the time and they know that the medical insurance will pay, then it distorts the market. So moral hazard occurs when insured persons can raise the liabilities of the insurer without the knowledge of the insurer. So the behavior of the clients make that insurers have to pay more. So let's look at figure 10.2. That's the third party payment problem. The third party is the medical insurance company. They are the third party and they pay a lot of money. So if, let's say, we don't have medical insurance and we just have a supply and demand curve, the fixed lines of health services. Supply and demand curve, then the market equilibrium will be at point A, where the two curves cross. And what is the total spending? Well, the total spending is just price times quantity. Price times quantity. Total spending is always price times quantity, so it's the squared P0 A Q0 0. That pink square, that's the total spending. So just remember how that rectangle looks. That's total spending if the private market is in operation. But you know how medical insurance works. You go to the doctor and you just have to pay a small portion of the cost. You just pay a premium on a small amount of money. So members, for example, only pays P1 if they go to the doctor. So if you pay less, then your demand will be higher. So if the price is P1, then you will demand Q1 services. I think it's true that if you know that the medical insurance company will pay, then you will be inclined to go to the doctor more often. If they pay everything, you can go to the doctor every day. So members of medical aid only pays P1 and therefore demands Q1. So that sounds okay, but it's not okay. Why? Why is that? Because the suppliers of the services, if we are on the supply curve, at what price would the suppliers be willing to produce Q1? There's huge pressure on them to produce Q1, so they will just raise the price. Otherwise, they won't be willing to produce Q1. So they will increase the price to P2, and if consumers demand Q1 and the price is P2, the total payment is now much more than before. It's P2CQ10. That's the rectangle. That's the total payment. But what is the proportion of the private consumer in that total? It's only P1. They only pay P1 and they get Q1 quantity of services. The total is the total rectangle, and the very small portion is paid by the private person, and the rest is paid by the insurance company, the medical insurance company. So can you understand why medical insurance companies are under huge pressure right now? And they are suffering to make all the payments. So they make it stricter and stricter to belong to them, and they are decreasing in the benefits that they offer year by year, and it's actually very rational behavior by them to do that. Figure 10.3 stresses the fact that an in-kind subsidy will always have an excess burden. Let's have a market demand curve, the negative slope, and let's say it could be any commodity. So this argument holds for any commodity. So let's say the marginal cost is constant. It just costs this constant amount to produce another unit of product X. The market equilibrium is at E0, and the consumer surplus at E0 is that pink triangle, because that is what the consumers are willing to pay at P0, but they only pay P0. So everything above P0, below the demand curve, is the consumer surplus. So if the government, and that's equilibrium at E0, if the government then subsidizes the good by amount P0, P1, the red curly bracket size, they give a subsidy on the price. Now consumers only pay P1. How much will they demand at P1? They will demand more, isn't it? So they will go to equilibrium point E1. They will demand Q1 if the price is only P1, because the government pays the difference. What is the size of the consumer surplus now? Well, the consumer surplus is bigger now, because it's the amount below the demand curve above the price level. So the consumer surplus has certainly increased. But how big is the subsidy? So Q1 is sold, and the subsidy is the vertical distance between P1 and P0. So that blue area is now the additional benefit. That's the additional consumer surplus to the consumer. If you subtract the first consumer surplus from the second. But the total subsidy is that rectangle. That's the total subsidy, because it's the size of the subsidy times Q1. Can you see that rectangle is bigger than the gain to the consumers? So the consumers gain the blue area, but it costs the government the red area. So that gives us an excess burden of that red portion, E0, E1, B. That is the excess burden. So unfortunately, I will not finish this chapter 10 in one video. I've had my eye on the time, and there's a very small portion left, which I will then cover in the second video.